preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm John Resquet, Education Director of the 92nd Street Y, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y and to this first distinguished lectureship in the humanities. A few preliminary comments. During the past few years, we have substantially enriched humanities programming here at the 92nd Street Y. Major new lecture series provide a context for leading scholars and public figures to address critical issues in a wide range of subjects. This year alone, Doris Kearns, Jane McGregor Burns, Robert Motherwell, Jimmy Carter, Alan Greenspan, Leslie Gelb, Robert Coles, William Styron, Elie Wiesel, and Amos Oz are but a few of the individuals who have lectured here. In addition, we've launched a series of extraordinary humanities classes to provide smaller settings for those wishing to continue their study of the humanities. In order to make certain that these programs endure, we have established a humanities endowment fund. With the support of a $500,000 challenge grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we are creating a $2 million fund to underwrite these programs. As you entered the hall, you were provided with an envelope. It's a convenient way for you, the members of our audience, to join with us in this campaign, a campaign with the federal government to strengthen humanities programming here at the Y. We hope you'll join with us. At the conclusion of the lecture this evening, you, the members of the audience, will be able to ask questions of our speaker. I will return to the stage and recognize you directly from the stage. In addition, at the conclusion of the formal program, there will be an informal reception in the lounge adjacent to the rear of the hall, which will provide a moment for us and for you to greet our speaker and to share a glass of wine together. We hope you'll join us. Tonight, we launch a new annual lectureship at the 92nd Street Y. Virtually all of our programming here is presented in the context of series, which extend for several evenings. We do this because it provides a context for several perspectives to be shared on major issues. But we've concluded that there is also a need to present on a single evening a speaker of rare distinction who would be able to lecture on a subject emanating from his or her work and which would benefit from public discussion. The first individual to deliver the Y's distinguished lectureship in the humanities is a man of such distinction. Born in Vienna, Peter Berger received his MA and PhD from the New School. He has served on the faculties at the New School, Rutgers, and now Boston University, where he serves as university professor. Many of us were first introduced to Peter Berger's work in undergraduate sociology courses when we read Invitation to Sociology and the Social Construction of Reality. As my own interest in comparative religion evolved, his works, particularly The Sacred Canopy and A Rumor of Angels, were important both sociologically, and in addition, they helped, at least for many of us, explain aspects of reality. During the past decade, as his interests have extended to the Third World, to issues about modernization and the nature of pluralist America, and now to questions about capitalism itself, he has become recognized as one of the major public policy analysts and theoreticians in this country. Professor Peter Berger has been an important teacher for many of us who, like myself, have never set forth in his classroom. We are therefore deeply honored to have Peter Berger with us this evening. His subject, the resurgent religious quest in contemporary America and its social and political implications. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Peter Berger.
Thank you for a very generous, kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. I lived much of my adult life in New York City, but there are two New York institutions that I never set foot in. One is the Statue of Liberty, and the other is the 92nd Street Y, and I'm glad that at least one of the omissions is being remedied tonight. I'm going to read my speech, that is, I have a manuscript, which I assure you is not because I feel that what I have to say is such deathless prose that not a word must be lost, but rather this is a topic on which I have very much to say, and if I spoke from notes, I suspect I would run on for 3 hours, and to do so would be a violation of human rights, yours namely. So I will read this. I hope you do not find this too formal a way of dealing with things.
Louder, please.
Louder? Okay. Is the mic working? I think it's not working. Can you hear me in the back now?
Here,
Oh, you're going to work. Can you hear me now in the back? Okay, well, I will not repeat what I said before. I will only say I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to read my address, and I will begin doing so. Intellectuals, when addressing any topic of public import, have the tendency to fall into a very peculiar rhetorical style that might be called the crisis sermon. It consists of first giving an exceedingly gloomy picture of the situation at hand, in other words, proclaiming the existence of a grave crisis, and then suggesting just before the end that the advertised calamities might yet be averted if only people repented and accepted the speaker's point of view. Intellectuals do this, of course, because they have a vested interest in doing it. But also they do it because it is almost unavoidable if they deal with a topic in which they themselves have a stake. I'm very much afraid that I will not be able to avoid completely this crisis sermon style in what follows. I will indeed address myself to the topic of contemporary American religion, mainly as a sociologist, and contrary to many, I continue to adhere to the position that sociology is a value-free discipline. But I will not try to disguise the fact that I have strong personal commitments in the matter under discussion. Specifically, I am a Lutheran, committed to a liberal Protestant understanding of the Christian tradition. And I should stress that the adjective liberal here does not refer to a political, but to a theological position. Thus, I am far from indifferent to what is taking place on the American religious scene today, and toward the end, where this properly belongs in a crisis sermon, I will take the liberty of unapologetically discarding the pale mantle of sociological detachment. Another point should be made at the outset, particularly in this room. I will discuss mostly Protestant developments and will only deal very briefly with what is occurring outside the Protestant community. This, however, is not simply due to my own Protestant affiliation. Rather, it is sociologically appropriate to make this emphasis. This is not only because American civilization has been crucially shaped by Protestantism, and because the majority of Americans continue to be Protestants of one variety or another. It is also, and more importantly, because the most dynamic phenomenon in the American religious situation today is the massive upsurge of conservative Protestantism, to the extent that everything else that is happening must, I believe, be seen in relation to this central fact. Now, needless to say, the phenomenon has not gone unnoticed. At least since the mid-1970s, Jimmy Carter's campaign for the presidency was an important stimulus. Commentators in the media and in academia have drawn attention to strange religious rumblings in that mysterious hinterland known as Middle America. By 1980, especially with the appearance of the so-called New Christian Right and its role in the first Reagan campaign, a good many people in what might be described as the secular provinces of the nation were in a state of near panic about this development. Now, if one has one's social habitat in one of those provinces, say one is a professor in Greater Boston or an upper middle class housewife in New Jersey, one may easily get the idea that suddenly, out of nowhere, this religious tidal wave arose in an essentially secularized America. Such an idea would be seriously mistaken. American society as a whole has never been very secularized. Only certain areas, social even more than geographical areas, within it. Indeed, the most recent data on the religion of Americans strongly indicate that this society is at least as religious as it ever was, and quite possibly more religious than ever before. I would refer here to recent studies of American values undertaken by the Gallup organization and by Connecticut Mutual Life, and to the Middletown Replication Study, especially the book All Faithful People by Theodore Kaplow and his associates. Indeed, if one looks at America in a cross-national perspective, it sticks out in a very exceptional way indeed. By and large, throughout the world, there is empirical support for the thesis that modernization is positively correlated with secularization. Thus, the highly modernized societies of Western Europe and Japan score highest on both objective and subjective measures of secularity. Objective in the sense of religious activity, subjective as referring to the expressions of personal beliefs, with the Scandinavian countries standing out as paragons of secularized modernity. At the other pole are countries like India. America is the big exception. There is indeed a secularized sector, significantly located in the cultural centers of the society. But the rest of the country, no matter how modernized, continues to be furiously religious. This is not the place to speculate on why America has, as it were, been shielded from the secularizing effects of the modernization process. I happen to think that there are possible explanations of this in American history. But the fact must be registered. It is as if we had a little Sweden superimposed on a vast India. And that image may already help us in understanding what is happening today. Nor, of course, did the evangelical upsurge of the 1970s occur ex nihilo. Conservative evangelical Protestantism has always been a very important presence in this country, and in sections of the country it has been the predominant religious form for a very long time. What one may observe today is rather an intense activation and a sort of nationalization of this particular religious community. We are beginning now to have an increasingly clear picture of the contours of this evangelical resurgence. I would refer, for example, to the excellent recent study, American Evangelicalism by James Hunter. The most obvious fact here, of course, is the sheer growth in numbers. All the conservative Protestant churches are coming through with what one may call truly Japanese growth rates, while the liberal churches are declining or just about maintaining their membership. But there is more here than just numerical growth. Evangelicalism is becoming a significant presence in parts of the country and among population groups where it was previously very marginal. Also, evangelicalism is becoming more self-assured and politically assertive on the national scene. Thus, evangelicalism benefits both from conversion, that is, it is attracting people from other religious backgrounds, and from the social mobility of its original membership, that is, people from evangelical backgrounds are moving both geographically and into higher socioeconomic levels. The second development has a certain analogy to the assimilation of ethnic immigrants. Conservative Protestants, of course, are not immigrants, and they are not exactly an ethnic group, but the manner in which they are now moving into the centers of the society is quite reminiscent of what happened earlier on to Catholics and Jews. In that limited sense, evangelicalism is being Americanized, and this process of assimilation will change them as it will change the larger society. Here too, it is useful, I think, to look at all this in a cross-national perspective. In the contemporary world, there are two massive, immensely powerful religious movements. One, of course, is conservative Islam, shaking up all the Muslim societies from the Atlantic Ocean to the China Sea. The other is conservative Protestantism, with an even wider geographical scope. It is sweeping across East Asia, with a notable exception of Japan, most dramatically in South Korea, which, if present trends continue, will have a Protestant majority early in the next century, but also in Taiwan and in the Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. Conservative Protestantism, often in syncretistic combination with indigenous folk religion, is in a neck-to-neck competition with Islam in Black Africa. And perhaps most surprising of all, it is growing rapidly in Latin America. Thus, for example, it is estimated that about 20% of the population of Guatemala is now Protestant. Neither the reasons for this nor its enormous social and political implications can be pursued. But it is significant for the present topic, if only because American evangelicals are very much aware of these foreign developments, and this awareness is probably related to their growing sense of being part of a great historic wave. Now, a word of caution. A number of commentators, usually hostile ones, have compared the Protestant and the Muslim versions of what they often call fundamentalism, which is usually a pejorative term. There may well be certain parallels, especially as regards the psychology of religion and play in both cases. But there are also decisive differences. The most important difference is this. Conservative Muslims have an image of the ideal society that derives from the second half of the first millennium AD, somewhere around 900 AD. The ideal imagery of conservative Protestants, by contrast, belongs squarely in the 19th century. Much more is involved here than a hiatus of 1,000 years. The first imagery is pre-modern and in many ways anti-modern. The ideals evoked by the Protestant imagination belong to precisely the period when Western society was going through its most intensive modernizing phase. It is by no means anti-modern. Indeed, especially the Third World, a case can be made that this kind of Protestantism is uniquely suited to modernizing populations. Or, if you will, Max Weber is being proven right from Seoul, which incidentally houses the largest Protestant congregation in the world, to Santiago de Chile. In any case, one should be very careful before one understands conservative Protestantism in America as some sort of counter-modernizing movement, a label, by the way, which fits much better some of the countercultural movements whose members are most appalled by the evangelical upsurge. Any religious phenomenon touches upon the deepest levels of the human spirit. One must be very cautious if one tries to interpret the often wild stirrings of this spiritual realm by the arid methods of the social sciences. Still, I think that the social scientist can make some contributions to our understanding of the particular phenomenon at issue here. I will suggest two interpretations. One more narrowly in terms of the sociology of religion, the other a broader sociological interpretation of the cultural dynamics of American society. Looked at in sociology of religion terms, the conservative upsurge is a protest against secularization. As a faithful adherent of Max Weber, let me point out that this is not just an interpretation brought from the outside, but rather is the way in which conservative Protestants interpret themselves and what they are about. Their opposition is to what they call secular humanism, not a bad term if one divests it of its negative connotations in conservative rhetoric. Where, in what is still an intensely religious society, is this secularization to be found? In two places, I would suggest. One I have already mentioned, in the centers of elite culture. The word center to be understood more in a social than a geographical sense, though of course there are physical concentrations of secular humanists. I should know I live in what is probably the place of densest concentration. Now, most Americans couldn't care less what happens in these places, except for one simple but crucially important fact. These same circles have been quite successful in imposing their values on the rest of the population, by way of the educational system, the communications media, and last not least, the law. This is why the Supreme Court decision banning prayer in the public schools was such a powerful trigger in activating the conservative protest. Richard Newhouse, in the title of his recent book, has given a graphically descriptive name to the secular humanist ideal for American society, the naked public square, denuded, that is, of any religious symbolism. Conservative Protestantism is a protest against this secularization of public life. But there is also what quite some time ago Thomas Luckman called secularization from within. That is, the substitution of secular for religious contents within the mainline Protestant churches. These secular contents in the main have been a theologically unappetizing mix. Has the mic gone out? Oh, okay. These secular contents have been in the main a theologically unappetizing mix of psychotherapy and politics. And the fact that the politics has been consistently left of center hasn't made the melange any more palatable to many Americans. Thus, conservative Protestantism is also a reaction against secularization within mainline churches. One of the early interpretations of the phenomenon, Dean Kelly's book, Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, 1972, uses this line of argument. It is, I believe, quite valid, at least as a partial explanation. Most people, except perhaps in Cambridge, Massachusetts, go to church because they want to worship God and to hear the age-old message about God's dealings with men. They don't go to church to receive psychotherapeutic advice or running commentaries on American foreign policy, especially, needless to say, if they dislike the advice and disagree with the commentaries. Thanks to religious liberty, these people have no reason to stay in churches where their religious needs are being systematically frustrated. Logically enough, they go elsewhere. Another earlier book about religion, Jeffrey Haddon's The Coming Storm in the Churches, 1969, may serve as another interesting benchmark for what has happened. Haddon based his argument on data from the 1960s, which showed that mainline Protestant clergy were consistently more liberal, socially and politically, as well as theologically, than their congregations. He predicted that there would be increasing conflict between the clerical leadership and the laity, a growing storm. Well, in retrospect, one can say that Haddon was both right and wrong. The gap between clergy and laity has continued, even deepened, and there have been various stormlets, if not storms, within the mainline churches. But the big conflict he predicted, at least to date, has failed to materialize. The reason is terribly simple. The lay people who were most annoyed didn't make a lot of fuss. They just quietly stole away, taking themselves, and not unimportantly their financial support, elsewhere. All in all, what has happened here is a particularly striking verification of one of W.R. Inge's nastier dicta: he who marries the spirit of the age soon finds himself a widower. It holds important lessons for all religious liberals who believe that institutional survival depends on accommodation to the zeitgeist. So far, so good, or so bad. I think, though, that there are broader sociological considerations that can help us in understanding the phenomenon. They have to do with class. More specifically, they have to do with what some have called the rise of a new class in America, and incidentally in other Western societies, A class best described as those people who make their living from the production and distribution from symbolic knowledge, or people in the teaching, caring, and communicating industries. The conservative Protestant upsurge can then be seen as part of the rebellion against the cultural and political power of this class. Now, we are dealing here with a recent development. It didn't really start until after World War II. Its dimensions and features are as yet less than clear. There is a limited database for some of the very sweeping statements, pro and con, that have been made about it. For example, by Irving Kristol on the con side, Alvin Gouldner on the pro side. Interestingly, Kristol and Gouldner agreed on the empirical facts concerning this new class. Only what Kristol took to be bad news, Gouldner looked upon as the best news in town. Still, a number of statements, I think, can be made with a measure of assurance. American society today is in the midst of a cultural war, a Kulturkampf, a battle over a number of fairly clear issues. On both sides of the conflict, there are clusters of values and opinions ranging from national policies to matters of personal lifestyle. One may mention here such issues as the use of military force in the foreign policy of the United States, the merits of American patriotism, not so much in the abstract where everyone is a patriot, but as applied to specific national objectives, capitalism and the range of the welfare state, the environment, the problem of crime, and last but emphatically not least, all the issues that have been raised by the feminist movement. Now, what is important to understand is that views on all these issues are not distributed randomly across the population. Far from it. They tend to cluster together, and they tend to be correlated with socioeconomic status. They cluster. An individual opposed to US policy in Central America is likely to be positively disposed to the feminist agenda. An individual opposed to abortion is likely to have pro-business attitudes, and so on. These clusterings may not have a logic that would be persuasive to, say, a philosopher from Outer Mongolia, but they are empirically real all the same. But these values and opinions also tend to correlate with class. Tell me an individual's occupation and income, and I can make a reasonably intelligent guess where he or she will come out on these matters. Of course, there will be cases where I'll be wrong. There are always class traitors, but that is true of all statements about human society. In other words, the cultural conflict has an important dimension of class conflict, Kulturkampf and Klassenkampf. Put differently, we are confronted here with a conflict between class cultures. A central battleground, of course, is the abortion issue. It seems to me that it very convincingly shows the class dynamics I have proposed. A recent sociological study of pro-life and pro-choice activists in California, Christine Luca's Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood, gives an excellent picture of the sharply divergent social characteristics of these two groups. The author, in her analysis, does not employ the class categories to which I have referred, but her findings bear them out very persuasively. Put very simply, class, not gender, not even religious affiliation, is the major predictor of an individual's stance on the abortion issue. By the way, employing conventional sociological categories, it would appear that the most pro-abortion grouping consists of upper-income white males, the most anti-abortion grouping of lower-income black females. On several of the other clusters enumerated before, for example, support for American military power or lack of such support or lack of support for a strong environmental policy, for harsher treatment of criminals, or for the Equal Rights Amendment, on all of these there are data indicating similar class cleavages. It seems to me that all of this is terribly important in understanding contemporary American society and some similar constellations in Western Europe, and especially in understanding recent American politics. I have no time to go into this here. But the class-based cultural conflict is the broader background for the phenomenon that does interest us here tonight. I would hypothesize that, as often before in history, religious symbols are employed today as weapons in a class struggle. I'm using a Marxist phrase here. I trust it is clear that my analysis of the American class system has very little to do with the way Marxists see it. In other words, at least a portion of the people constituting the conservative Protestant upsurge are not only expressing themselves religiously, but are engaged in a protest against social and political developments that in themselves have nothing to do with religion. On both sides, religion, as so often before, serves to legitimate class interests. A military analogy suggests itself here. The class armies are arrayed against each other in various societal battlefields. And on both sides, there are the military chaplains invoking divine blessing on their cause and assuring the troops that God is on their side. This, so to speak, chaplaincy function is, of course, most evident in the most politicized church organizations, such as Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority on one side or the National Council of Churches on the other. Very frequently, of course, there are people in the middle or the battle lines are confused. All the same, if one looks at the public posture of mainline liberal Protestantism, on the great majority of the issues in question, there is no doubt where these churches come out. Their social and political views are highly consonant with those of one camp, the one intended by the new class designation, and ipso facto highly distasteful to the other camp. This has indeed blown up a big storm, visibly so during the presidential campaign last fall. It is not quite the storm that Haddon predicted, but it is really much more serious than what he predicted. What Haddon saw was a storm in the relatively limited teacup of mainline Protestantism. The storm we are witnessing today threatens the symbolic unity of American society, and given the international position of the United States, has ramifications that reverberate far beyond its borders. In this American Kulturkampf, as in just about every other development within this country, much more is at stake than the future of a few domestic religious institutions. Let me just cite one example, the way in which the two Protestant camps line up in the matter of US policy in the Middle East. American Protestantism is a vast social universe, and I do not for a moment pretend that the foregoing observations apply to all of it. Thus, I've said nothing about the black churches, themselves a complex and variegated phenomenon in which, as I see it, there's an interesting socio-cultural tug of war at work. Theologically and in terms of their religious praxis, most black Protestants would have a natural affinity with the conservative upsurge. They literally march to the same music. At least since the civil rights movement, however, black clergy and black congregations have been active within a political milieu that is located on the other side of the aforementioned divide. I regret that I cannot go on about this important segment of the Protestant scene. Nor have I said anything about the Lutheran community, divided into three major denominations, two of which are about to merge with each other, and I suspect to merge gradually into the liberal Protestant mainstream, in which they will lose their distinctive identity, while the third, the Missouri Synod, still containing over 2 million members, stands by itself in splendid isolation both from the mainstream and from the evangelical turbulence. But then obviously one cannot cover everything. Rather, I would like, however briefly, to make some observations about the three other principal players in the field: the Catholics, the Jews, and the Eastern Orthodox Christians. Catholics, to begin with the obvious, are different from any other religious group in America in that they are members of a still tightly organized international system. To be sure, the system has become much looser in the last 20 years, but it is still true, and will almost certainly continue to be true, that in the end, Rome determines at least the outer limits of change. Given this fact, it is remarkable to what extent American Catholicism has begun to resemble the liberal Protestant mainstream. The great watershed, of course, was the Second Vatican Council. This assemblage, or at any rate its great majority, had no intention of starting a revolution. It wanted a reasonable and controlled aggiornamento, a prudent adjustment of the Church to the demands of the times. What then happened may serve as a textbook example of Max Weber's doctrine of unintended consequences and also of the political science theory which says that if you open one window too many in an authoritarian system, all hell will break loose. The trouble with this theory is that so far it doesn't tell us just which window is the one too many. The most visible changes brought about by Vatican II were liturgical. I suspect that given the importance of liturgy in the Roman tradition, these were crucial for everything else. From one day to the next, Latin was abolished and replaced by rather tepid vernacular. This was supposed to make the liturgy more understandable to the laity, which perhaps it did. It also invited the sort of reflection about the meaning of words that leads to theological trouble. The congregation was now invited to participate more actively in the liturgical proceedings, and, a terrible mistake in my opinion, the priest was turned around, facing the congregation from behind the altar, thus powerfully suggesting that the object of worship was right here within the community rather than beyond it, a powerful symbol of secularization if there ever was one. Then, various elements of folk piety, especially those directed to the Blessed Virgin and to the saints, were marginalized, if not proscribed. And, perhaps the worst mistake, sociologically speaking, the clergy were strongly encouraged to preach on all occasions, changing them overnight from ministrants of awesome mysteries to spouters of debatable opinions. All of this has come to mean, in terms of actual social experience, that someone dropping into a Catholic service today may be there for a while before being sure that it is indeed a Catholic service and not a liturgically enriched Protestant one. Be this as it may, as far as the topic under discussion is concerned, American Catholicism has become Protestantized to the point that the public statements of the American bishops are about as predictable as those of the bishops of the United Methodist Church, and with one or two equally predictable exceptions, pretty much identical in content. The central bureaucratic apparatus of American Catholicism has been captured by the same new class types as inhabit the headquarters of the central Protestant organizations. Major portions of the religious orders, for sociological and psychological reasons that are perhaps not all that hard to surmise, have moved even farther to the left than the central bureaucracy, serving as a shrinking but very active assault force on behalf of these political causes. The results have been very similar to some of those observed in the Protestant community: confusion and disaffection among the laity, financial drain, which is especially critical for the Catholic educational system, a precipitous decline in candidates for the priesthood, and the shrinkage of religious orders. There are two important differences, though. There is, and probably cannot be, a Catholic equivalent to the conservative upsurge. The so-called charismatic movement, as far as I understand it, has a different character. And given Catholic beliefs, it is much more difficult for Catholic lay people to quietly go elsewhere. For a Catholic, there is no elsewhere. These differences, along with the control still exercised by Rome, especially under the present Pope, over the wilder reaches of religio-political radicalism, may make the crisis more protracted and slow-burning than the Protestant one. I cannot resist the temptation of making a sociological prediction here. The two recent and much discussed statements by the Catholic bishops, the one on issues of war and peace, and the one still in draft form on the economy, have illustrated very clearly to what degree their location in the current cultural conflict has become partisan. The bishops have now promised us another letter, this one on the status of women. I predict that with two necessary exceptions, namely abortion and the ordination of women, they will wholeheartedly endorse the entire gamut of feminist causes. I also predict that they will particularly endorse what is becoming the feminist cause par excellence, namely comparable worth, which they will be able to show with unassailable logic to be consonant with the essentially anti-capitalist doctrine of economic rights, which they have already espoused. Sociology is an empirical discipline subject to falsification. I am hereby laying at least one part of my interpretation of American Catholicism open to being falsified in the near future. I am much more of an outsider when it comes to American Judaism, but I will venture some observations, necessarily very tentative ones. It seems clear to me that secularization has been as much a force in the synagogue as it has been in the church in America. Perhaps its impact here has been mitigated by the often remarked fact that Judaism is more concerned with orthopraxis than with orthodoxy, that is, with observance rather than belief, and thus may be less vulnerable to cognitive challenge. At the same time, I tend to think that Jews have overestimated the importance of this difference when it comes to the inroads of secularization. As soon as an individual asks himself why he should observe this or that element of halakha, he finds himself in a cognitive process that is structurally similar to the Christians questioning this or that element of the creed. Here, too, there have been various degrees of resistance and accommodation to modernity, which are fairly faithfully reflected by the three major Jewish denominations. Indeed, the very fact that American Judaism has divided up into denominations, a Protestant category in a profound sense, indicates the extent to which it has been assimilated into the American religious situation. But there is also, of course, the uniquely Jewish synthesis of religion and ethnicity, which sharply differentiates Judaism from any Christian group and which has led American Jews to worry endlessly about the meaning of their Jewish identity. There is no Christian analogy to this. Nor, needless to say, is there a Christian parallel to the American Jewish relationship with the State of Israel and to the interaction of Judaism and Zionism in the American Jewish consciousness. As far as the current cultural conflict is concerned, there is a particular dilemma for American Jews. This dilemma, I think, is social rather than religious. At least since the New Deal, the political proclivities of American Jews have tended toward the liberal and the left-of-center positions of the spectrum. What is sociologically more significant, a disproportionate number of Jews belong to the new knowledge class, and thus very naturally participate in its class culture and share its class interests. But there are at least two important countervailing interests. The direction taken by liberal social policy since the invention of affirmative action is sharply threatening to Jews, precisely because of their disproportionate place in what I have called the teaching, caring, and communicating sectors of the labor force. And second, commitment to the survival of the State of Israel sharply limits what would otherwise be a natural affinity to the quasi-pacifist and third worldist positions of the new class camp. I think that on this one I shall be prudent and refrain from making any predictions. I feel that I ought to say at least a word about Eastern Christian Orthodoxy, a very interesting sleeper on the American religious scene. It is instructive to reflect upon the statistical fact that there are almost exactly the same number of Orthodox Christians as there are Jews in this country. So far, the impact of Orthodox Christianity on American culture has been minimal when compared with the Jewish influence. The reason for this, of course, is that until very recently, Orthodoxy has been encapsulated in several ethnic subcultures, Greek, Russian, and so on. This is now changing. The most dramatic change has been the decisive de-ethnicizing of the largest Russian community, which has now become the Orthodox Church in America, with its liturgy in English, with no special links to any foreign country, and with both clergy and laity coming increasingly from non-Orthodox ethnic backgrounds. Historically, this is the first time in history that a sizable body of Orthodox Christians have become, as it were, players in a pluralistic field. It will be very interesting to observe what effects this will have on them, and even more interesting, what impact, if any, they will make on the overall American religious scene. What are the prospects? As far as the conservative Protestant resurgence itself is concerned, there is no reason to assume that it will soon abate. It is far too massive and powerful a phenomenon. As the evangelical community becomes more established and ipso facto more culturally respectable, it is inevitable that it will modify some of its more grating deviances from the majority consensus. In other words, in the long run, evangelicalism will also become domesticated. But as John Maynard Keynes observed, in the long run will all be dead. The long run in this instance means at least one generation, and a lot can happen in that time. One development that I expect to continue happening is the decline of the mainline Protestant churches, barring a reversal of direction that would be tantamount to a revolution, an unlikely event, I should think. If my sociological interpretation has merit, the future of American religion will be strongly determined by the outcome of the current culture conflict, read class conflict. Assuming that there are no catastrophic events at hand, such as major wars or an economic collapse, in which cases all bets are off, I would predict an ongoing but indecisive continuation of these battles for a long time. Given the structure of an advanced modern society, it is unlikely that either side will achieve total victory. Each side will win some and will lose some. There will be political compromises. There may be some blurring of battle lines. If I were to make bets, I would bet that the new class will win many of its social and cultural causes, such as those on the feminist agenda, but will lose more of its economic and foreign policy causes, such as those that would undermine capitalism or the international position of the United States. In any case, these changes and compromises would then be reflected very accurately within the chaplaincies of the respective class armies. Speaking sociologically, then, I cannot really conform to the crisis sermon style. Neither American society nor American religion are quite in crisis, if by that phrase one understands a situation in which cataclysmic change is about to occur, or in which the very cohesion of the society is in peril. I must therefore confess that it is as a committed American Christian, and not as a sociologist, that I am tempted to a crisis sermon conclusion. I shall yield to the temptation. But I should emphasize that this conclusion is based on my personal beliefs and values. That is, it is not based on the empirical data as such, and cannot be put in the form of falsifiable hypotheses or predictions. I'm a theological liberal, and therefore find the current conservative upsurge unacceptable in most of its religious contents. At the same time, I emphatically reject the notion that theological liberalism implies a secularization of religion. Thus, when I started to study American Protestantism in the late 1950s, I was appalled by what were then the secularizing contents, a celebration of middle-class morality and of the American way of life, increasingly admixed with pop psychotherapy, as exemplified by the works of Norman Vincent Peale. As I see the world politically, both in this country and abroad, I find the current mixture of left liberal ideological agendas even less palatable. I am appalled as a Christian in America that the public postures of the major churches should increasingly be nothing more but near automatic reflexes of the class cultures to which their leaders belong or aspire. I don't think the chaplaincy in a class war is the proper function of religious ministry to society. I am particularly repelled by that peculiar form of false consciousness which in mainline Protestantism and now in the Catholic community perceives as a prophetic mission what is in fact a Pavlovian reaction to the class position of the alleged prophets. At the risk of offending some Christian ears here, I would venture a rephrasing of a New Testament proposition. Do not call yourself a prophet if your hometown agrees with you. The proper task of the Church is to bear witness to the tradition in preaching and through the sacraments. Prophecy, in its terrifying biblical meaning, is a rare and desperate mandate. The normal social ministry of the Church, in addition to ordinary caritas, is to mediate, to reconcile, to provide a neutral ground where societal antagonists can meet as human beings. When political partisanship becomes a routine feature of the Church's public role, the consequences are much more serious than divisiveness and confusion within the laity. The most serious consequence is that the Church loses one of its defining marks, that of Catholicity. It ceases to embrace all Christians, and this means that it ceases to be the Church. I must leave it to others to draw out the implications of this, if any, for Judaism. Let me conclude. If this were really a sermon preached within my own Protestant community, it could only be a call to metanoia, to repentance and reform, to a turning away from the various secular idols which so many have worshipped in the place of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But this is not a sermon. I have no authority to preach. Therefore, faute de mieux, I will conclude as a sociologist. I see little likelihood for the sort of radical redirection that would change the character and the prospects of liberal Protestantism in America. Put differently, the crisis that I would like to see as a Christian is improbable in my perspective as a sociologist. To which I might add most things that I would like to see are improbable in my perspective, and that's another story. But even as a sociologist, I cannot quite suppress an intriguing thought. I have imagined a big research project in the sociology of religion in Europe around, say, the very beginning of the 16th century. A band of Columbia or Berkeley trained sociologists transported backward by time machine, interviewing a cross-national sample of people all over the continent, even amplifying the study by depth interviews and participant observation. I have the consoling hunch that they would have failed to predict the Reformation.
I want to thank Professor Berger on behalf of all of us for this sweeping and yet most stimulating lecture. And I know we have a sociologically distinguished audience here. I see members of faculties from universities and others, even members of the clergy. So I want to recognize questions. Please make the questions brief. Stand up so they can be heard. Okay? Yes, sir.
Well, it depends who you mean by these people. I mean, if you refer to the entire community, which I have described, which I've talked about, which is about 40 million Americans, that's much too broad a category. If you're referring to the sort of fanatical wing of this, I would fully agree with you. But sure, I mean, I have run into these people, and I dare say I like them as little as you do. But I would suggest one thing to you. I am not impressed with the reasonableness and the willingness to listen of their counterparts on the other side. And well, let me be specific. In this case, I think I can say literally for my sins, occasionally have reason to be in major centers of Protestant theology in the United States, liberal Protestant theology. I would say the fanaticism on issues like American policy in Central America, various feminist issues, you name it, any point on that agenda, let me be even more specific, at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, is not an iota less than the fanaticism on the other side in places like Jerry Falwell's Liberty College in Virginia. These are mirror images of each other. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Now, I'm not saying this, who is right and who is wrong. I mean, in my own view, if you want my own views, I think on some issues I'm on this side, on some issues I'm on the other side. But simply describing, as you did, the social psychology of this, it's the same. And that's very important. Yes, I'm afraid of both these groups of fanatics, yes.
Any other questions? Yes.
Dr. Berger, I'm a little confused about your correlation between the new class and the attitudes, the liberal attitudes, or perhaps even the fanatical attitudes in such places as Union Seminary. I know you provided with reference to the California study on abortion showing liberal attitudes among white males and conservatives among black females. But I suspect that kind of a study is not replicated in terms of abortion or many other areas of U.S. foreign policy or other kinds of liberal issues across the country. For example, the attitudes against U.S. involvement in Central America runs around 70% of the population.
That depends what question you ask.
Well, an overt war. But my point is, though, in correlating these attitudes with what seems to be a upper middle income group, I think you build a lot of your other assertions, and I would like to know if that is what you meant to do.
Well, I mean, I tried to be, obviously I couldn't deal with any single point at great length. If you ask me as a sociologist, one has to be very careful here. On some of these issues we have very rich data. On others we have less rich data. And one has to go by, well, if you want to be very rigorous, hypothesize on the basis of these data, on the basis of impressions, other less rigorous kind of information. But let me not get into this sociological morass here. Let me simply say, it seems to me anybody in this country who moves around a bit and doesn't stay in one particular social or geographical milieu, I think is likely to have the same sense. In other words, if you, well, let's put it very simply, 60% of the American electorate voted for Ronald Reagan. They were not randomly distributed across the political spectrum. You can make guesses. You meet somebody, you find out, this has happened to me all the time, you find out who they are in terms of class, you begin to predict. Now, sometimes you are wrong, but there is a high rate of consistency here, and I think if one lives in this society, one knows it. Now, in the abortion case, we happen to have very strong data. On some of these others, you are quite right. The data are less strong. That's true of any phenomenon which is recent, current, ongoing. It's one problem with sociology. Most of what is taught as sociology is data that are 20 years old. That's the nature of the beast.
Yes.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know any very reliable data on this. My hunch is, but underline hunch, that this tends to be upper middle class more than anything else, but I'm really not sure about that.
Yes, sir.
You're describing class struggle, it seems, between a upper middle class liberal orientation and a lower middle class or a broader conservative orientation. But what about the conflict that we saw in the Republican Party between George Bush and his right, the evangelical and Christian right? In other words, are the chairman of the boards of the corporations of this country included in these polls? Where do they fall within this struggle? And if I can ask one other question. Supposedly, Americans have television on or are watching it for 7 hours a day on the average. Now, if the liberal wing is concentrated in culture and communication, what does that say about the impact of media upon this country?
Okay, let me answer your first question, second question first, and put it in partisan terms. Thank God most Americans don't watch the news. When they watch this stuff, they watch sitcoms and sports mostly, and that's, I don't think, has a heavy ideological content. But in terms of your first question, which is, well, one could expand on your second question too, but let me get to your first question. I don't know exactly in terms of what's happening within the Republican Party or where you plays Mr. Bush, but see, I think the basic, it's not upper middle class versus lower middle class. That would be a misunderstanding. If I were to describe this hypothesis, and at this point I think if you wanted to be careful, we should speak of a hypothesis. It's not absolutely verified. I have strong reasons for thinking it's plausible. It's not conclusive. Okay, but it's not upper middle class versus lower middle class. Rather, it's that the entire middle class has split into two. In other words, vertically. On the one hand, you have the old middle class, which essentially is people who make their living from the production and distribution of material goods and services. That certainly includes your corporation types that you were talking about. Plus various old allied professions, medicine, but excluding psychotherapy, physical medicine, that's important, dentists, corporation lawyers, tax consultants, etc. And this goes from top to bottom. I mean, it has an upper stratum and a lower stratum. And then you have this new teaching, caring, communicating class, which derives its livelihood from very different sources. And these two, and again, it has an upper level, Harvard professors, whatever, but then it has a lower, a petty new class, which is social workers and geriatric sex counselors and, people, branches of government bureaucracy, quality of life organizations. And these people, I would suggest, have, at least the hypothesis would be, not only have a different class culture, they also have different class interests, and they can be studied. That is the conflict. So it's a very interesting and different kind of class dynamics from what we still learn in sociology under the heading of stratification. Now, I think one should emphasize, since my own work is mostly outside the United States now, we are talking about a North American, West European phenomenon. Don't think of other parts of the world in these terms. In Western Europe, it's very similar indeed. And I would say the politics, not only of the United States, but of Britain, France, West Germany, make an awful lot of sense when you look at it in these terms.
Yes.
So I've heard, yes.
Would you just speak a little louder?
And what I hear both of you say is that there should be a greater distinction between theology and politics, and that the blending together of the two is somehow destructive of the space.
Well, I don't think I want to speak for Richard Newhouse. We agree on some things, we don't agree on others. I have some criticisms of the book that I mentioned. I don't want to get into that position in particular. He's a friend of mine, but some things we don't agree. But if you ask me for my own position, I don't know if I'd put it quite in the terms you did. I'd have to become theological at this point. So let me be unambiguously theological. This has to do with one's understanding of the Christian church. In traditional Christian theology, Protestant as well as Catholics, one of the essential hallmarks of the church is its universality. That is, within the church, there are no men, no women, there are no races, there are no classes. Everyone is part of that worshiping community. Everyone who adheres to this faith. If the church becomes politically partisan, and especially if that political partisanship enters into the worship of the church, whoever does not share that partisanship is implicitly excommunicated. Theologically speaking, that is about the most serious thing you can do. That is far more serious than any particular political disagreement with what happens to be the position of the church. Now, you said, you surmise that I'm politically conservative. Depends what you mean by conservative. In terms of the American political spectrum, I would put myself somewhat right of center. True. One thing that troubles me about my church is that I disagree politically with some of its positions that are publicly taken. I don't like some of the sermons I hear. I don't like some of the prayers that I'm asked to participate in because they contain a political content with which I disagree. The theological point I have just made would be just as serious if the sermons and the liturgy expressed political views with which I agreed. So my position is not at all that the church should come around to a different political posture. My position is that the church should remember what it means to be the church. So the theological and the political argument for me are two very different things. And I am quite sure that, which is possible, I am not a fanatic, I'm not a closed-minded person on political issues. It's conceivable I might change my mind about certain political issues. I have in the past, which means I might move somewhat to the left again than from where I am now. I would not want, my position on the church issue would remain the same. It has nothing to do with that.
Yes, in the back row.
I don't quite get your question. Is there anything that I like? Is that what you're asking? Well, I mean, this is a very big country, and if you move around in it, as I do, you find people you feel you agree with, you find places where you feel comfortable, of course. But if I look at the entire religious scene in America, I find it singularly depressing. And what is most vital in this scene, there's no question about it, is evangelical Protestantism, which is very alien to me in terms of my theological and religious habits. What I find within my own community is absolutely dismal. I'm not tempted to become a Catholic, which actually wouldn't be much of an improvement. I mean, it's very much the same scene. I am not tempted to become a Jew or anything else. I mean, for me, it's an extremely depressing situation personally. But as I try to be very careful about this, anyone who is in such a position tends to think in crisis terms. Sort of the day of judgment is at hand. I have a sort of sociological conscience which tells me, be careful. I would love to see a crisis in American Protestantism. I don't quite see it. What's happening is much less dramatic, I think, and in terms of the mainline Protestant community, I see a long, drawn-out process, essentially, of decay and degeneration. But this could take a very long time. The Catholics, I think, are trying very hard to catch up, but for the reasons that I've mentioned, it may not be as fast. There are stronger countervailing forces, it seems to me, in the Catholic picture.
Yes?
Yeah, but they lose some of their kids. I mean, certainly in the United States, that conservative Baptists. If you mean fertility, yeah. Well, the population group we are talking about, at least traditionally, has had more kids than liberal Protestants. But I suspect this is changing. And in any case, as everyone knows, your kids don't necessarily follow in your footsteps. So. But this may be a factor. Yeah, could be.
Just want to interject a question from the chair, from at least the present chair. How do you explain the dismal state, in a certain way, which you just described, of contemporary religious life? And put one more follow-up. One of your colleagues, Thomas Luckmann, wrote, I think without you, in The Invisible Religion, that there was a great deal of religious activity, this was some years ago, going on, but it tended to take place outside of the traditional religious denominations. I'm just wondering, is there some relationship between this? Some have argued that in addition to the traditional religious groups, the worlds of psychotherapy and even the worlds of culture itself, some would say a new kind of hedonism is taking on a functional role similar to traditional religion. Does that account in part for the displacement of religious energy, the quest that's going on? Is it going on just outside of the religious arena?
Well, if you talk about Thomas Luckmann, I mean, there's a terminological problem here. I mean, what he calls religion is what most of us, including myself, would like to use a narrower term than he does. I mean, for him, religion is anything which is a symbolic integration of human life. That's very broad. Now, if you want to have that concept of religion, sure, you can say a lot of it is happening outside religious communities. I'm not interested in terminological disputes, I just thought I should point it out. Yes, I think that is of the very nature of what we call secularization, that instead of religious symbols serving to integrate life, to give meaning, to console, to inspire, whatever, there are secular meanings. But the ones that are available, it seems to me, have certain built-in problems. And whether you're talking about science, or whether you're talking about ideals of mental health or something of that nature, the psychotherapeutic context, or whether you're talking about political ideologies or nationalism or something like this. The basic problem, it seems to me, and I'm speaking now as a sociologist, not as a believer or a theologian, the basic problem is that they have limited use in the really critical moments of human life. And while, let us say, well, take a political ideology. Say your basic ideals are, I don't know, some sort of right-wing ideology, I don't know, left-wing, I don't care which one, okay? That integrates your life. Well, that's fine, especially if you are young, because then you feel you're immortal and you're not sick and you probably haven't had much grief. And then also it works when whatever suffering you encounter is due to political causes. I mean, if you are shot in the leg in the barricades, or you are facing danger from the enemy, this helps to inspire. Most of us are not in that situation. Most of us face illness and grief and frustration of a very non-political sort. What does it help me that I am an American nationalist if I face a serious operation, or if someone I love dies? It's meaningless. And religion, any human religion, one of its major functions in human life has been to provide meanings for these great tragedies and problems of human existence. So I think there's a built-in difficulty in secular value systems of the sort you describe.
Two final questions. Yes?
Well, I would say again, now speaking as a sociologist, it seems to me we should not exaggerate the crisis of American civil religion. I mean, if you compare the United States with many other societies in this world, it's a remarkably integrated society. I mean, no one there's no serious person thinks we're on the brink of civil war or disintegration in sort of Lebanon style. I mean, this is extremely unlikely. So there's a high degree of cohesion still in terms of shared values, a high degree of civility, of all kinds of things. So that we still have, if you want to call this civil religion, which is fine, it's a usable term, we still have a pretty, viable one. I think the culture conflict I've talked about is a certain threat to that. Now, maybe we shouldn't say crisis, but there's a certain threat to that. And it might become more serious. I would say at the moment the abortion issue may be the most serious in terms of splitting people and pitting them against each other with increasing violence, even physical violence, at least on one side of the issue. If you ask me for predictions, I did this before, barring real cataclysms, war, economic depression, which I think is relatively unlikely, though God knows we can't be sure of this. I would not see a total victory of either side. In other words, I don't think the civil religion is going to become either the agenda of Mr. Falwell or the agenda of whoever you want to point to on the other side. What I see is compromises. They're going to win. Each side is going to win some, lose some, and on certain issues, a new consensus might emerge after a lot of unpleasantness. This is even conceivable with the abortion issue, but I think it will take a rather long time. And in the meantime, there can be a lot of uncomfortable moments.
We'll take two more. I see a couple of people are about to jump out the window that they haven't had a chance. The second row, the dark, right. Yourself, right.
I don't know. If I were Jewish, I think I would not be very much concerned. I might be concerned on other grounds, such as what the gentleman in the back mentioned before. I mean, certain parts of this, the New Christian Right, it's fanaticism. I see virtually no element of anti-Semitism in this. Few fringe groups, very little anti-Semitism. And from a Jewish point of view, I mean, the reasons might seem crazy to a Jew, maybe even disturbing, but there's a very strongly positive attitude toward Israel. So I don't know, from a specifically Jewish point of view, I think I would probably say I'm neither very concerned or not very concerned. My concern would be much more, say, a Jew is an American citizen, yes, but then, that would be the same concerns I would have anyway. That's very cautiously how I would respond to that.
Yes, sir.
What do you think the place of the Easter religions is in this conflict? Why are people joining the Easter religion?
I mean, like Hinduism, Buddhism?
Hinduism, Hare Krishna, that kind of thing. Why does it have a new life in America?
Well, it's a very small phenomenon, very small. We have the most complete study we have of this is a big study that was done under Robert Bella's auspices in the early 70s in the San Francisco area. So if anywhere, that's where you'd find it. It's very small, very, very small. So I think if you look at the American scene as a whole, I don't think it's a significant factor. I find it personally a very interesting factor because my own work in recent years has taken me mostly to Asia, and I'm very interested in Asian religion. So I think it's a positive thing. Some of it is very positive. It's very challenging that the Western mind is beginning to deal with some of these real alternative ways of looking at reality. And some of this, especially the Buddhist part of it, with which I've had some contact in this country, is I think to be taken very seriously. But speaking as a sociologist of religion, I mean, that's speaking as a person. I find Buddhism very interesting, and I can very well understand why some Westerners might become Buddhists. I mean, I'm not tempted, but I can understand it. But as a sociologist of religion, which I think was the context of your question, it's not a significant phenomenon, and I think it's unlikely to become one.
Let me remind you that you can greet our speaker and greet members of the audience in the room in the back. I want to thank, on behalf of all of us, the audience and the board of the Y, Professor Berger, for joining us. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.